everybody, welcome back to another edition of Noontime Storytime. It's good to see you all again. As you might notice, there's more light in my living room today because I took the time to actually clean my windows this morning. So coronavirus housework is going well. Today, in addition to reading another chapter of Paddington, I'm going to read you Corduroy by Freeman, which is another of my absolute favorite books as a child. So hopefully you will be able to see the illustrations. Corduroy is a bear who once lived in the toy department of a big store. Day after day, he waited with all the other animals and dolls for someone to come along and take him home. See, there's Corduroy. The store was always filled with shoppers buying all sorts of things, but no one ever seemed to want a small bear in green overalls. Then one morning, a little girl stopped and looked straight into Corduroy's bright eyes. "Oh, Mommy," she said, "look, there's the very bear I've always wanted." "Not today, dear," her mother sighed. "I've spent too much already. Besides, he doesn't look new. He has lost the button to one of his shoulder straps." Corduroy watched them sadly as they walked away. "I didn't know I'd lost a button," he said to himself. "Tonight I'll go and see if I can find it." Late that evening, when all the shoppers had gone and the doors were shut and locked, Corduroy climbed carefully down from his shelf and began searching everywhere on the floor for his lost button. Suddenly, he felt the floor moving under him. Quite by accident, he had stepped onto an escalator, and up he went. Could this be a mountain, he wondered? I think I've always wanted to climb a mountain. He stepped off the escalator as it reached the next floor, and there before his eyes was a most amazing sight. Tables and chairs and lamps and sofas and rows of beds. "This must be a palace," Corduroy gasped. "I guess I've always wanted to live in a palace." He wandered around admiring the furniture. "This must be a bed," he said. "I've always wanted to sleep in a bed." And up he crawled onto a large, thick mattress. All at once he saw something small and round. "Why, here's my button," he cried, and he tried to pick it up. But, like all the other buttons on the mattress, it was tied down tight. He yanked and pulled with both paws until pop! Off came the button, and off the mattress Corduroy toppled. Bong! Into a tall floor lamp. Over it fell with a crash. Corduroy didn't know it, but there was someone else awake in the store. The night watchman was going on his rounds around the floor above. When he heard the crash, he came dashing down the escalator. "Now who in the world did that?" he exclaimed. "Somebody must be hiding in here." He flashed his light under and over the sofas and beds until he came to the biggest bed of all, and there he saw two fuzzy brown ears sticking up from under the covers. "Hello," he said. "How did you get upstairs?" The watchman tucked Corduroy under his arm and carried him down the escalator and set him on the shelf in the toy department with the other animals and dolls. Corduroy was just waking up when the first customers came into the store in the morning. And there, looking at him with a wide, warm smile, was the same little girl who had seen him only the day before. "I'm Lisa," she said, "and you're going to be my very own bear. Last night I counted what I saved in my piggy bank, and my mother said I could bring you home." "Shall I put him in a box for you?" the saleslady asked. "Oh, no, thank you," Lisa answered, and she carried Corduroy home in her arms. She ran all the way up 4 flights of stairs into her family's apartment and straight to her own room. Corduroy blinked. There was a chair and a chest of drawers, and alongside a girl-sized bed stood a little bed, just the right size for him. The room was small, nothing like that enormous palace in the department store. "This must be home," he said. "I know I've always wanted a home." Lisa sat down with Corduroy on her lap and began to sew a button on his overalls. "I like you the way you are," she said, "but you'll be more comfortable with your shoulder strap fastened." "You must be a friend," said Corduroy. "I've always wanted a friend." "Me too," said Lisa, and gave him a big hug. So that is the story of Corduroy by Don Freeman. And when I was younger, they filmed a little storybook version of it, and that was on television. So if I can find it, I will put the link below. And now for another chapter of A Bear Called Paddington. We are on chapter 4 now. Remember, first the Browns found Paddington in Paddington Station and took him home to number 32 Windsor Gardens, where he had a bath and made a huge mess. And then he went on a shopping trip where he made a huge mess. So there's kind of a theme that goes on in the Paddington stories. It's important to stay hydrated, so I drink a lot of water. And now, chapter 4 is titled A Disappearing Trick. And as you can see, Paddington is up to shenanigans. "Ooh," said Paddington. "Is it really for me?" He stared hungrily at the cake. It really was a wonderful cake. One of Mrs. Bird's best. It was covered with icing, and it had a cream and marmalade filling. On the top was one candle, and the words, "To Paddington, with best wishes for a happy birthday from everyone." It had been Mrs. Bird's idea to have a birthday party. Paddington had been with them for 2 months. No one, not even Paddington, knew quite how old he was, so they decided to start again and call him 1. Paddington thought this was a good idea, especially when he was told that bears had 2 birthdays every year, one in the summer and one in the winter. "Just like the Queen," said Mrs. Bird, "so you ought to consider yourself very important." Paddington did. In fact, he went round to his friend Mr. Gruber straight away and told him the good news. Mr. Gruber looked impressed and was very pleased when Paddington invited him to the party. "It's not often anyone invites me out, Mr. Brown," he said. "I don't know when I went out last, and I shall look forward to it very much indeed." He didn't say more at the time, but the next morning a van drew up outside the Browns' house and delivered a mysterious-looking parcel from all the shopkeepers in the Portobello Market. "Aren't you a lucky bear?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown when they opened the parcel and saw what was inside. It was a nice new shopping basket on wheels, with a bell on the side that Paddington could ring to let people know he was coming. Paddington scratched his head. "It's a job to know what to do first," he said as he carefully placed the basket with his other presents. "I shall have a lot of thank-you letters to write." "Perhaps you'd better leave them till tomorrow," said Mrs. Brown hastily. Whenever Paddington wrote any letters, he generally managed to get more ink on himself than on the paper, and he was looking so unusually smart, having had a bath the night before, that it seemed a pity to spoil it. Paddington looked disappointed. He liked writing letters. "Perhaps I can help Mrs. Bird in the kitchen?" he said hopefully. "I'm glad to say," said Mrs. Bird, as she emerged from the kitchen, "that I've just finished. But you can lick the spoon if you like." She had bitter memories of other occasions when Paddington had helped in the kitchen. "But not too much," she said, "or you won't have room for this." It was then that Paddington saw his cake for the first time. His eyes, usually large and round, became so much larger and rounder that even Mrs. Bird blushed with pride. "Special occasions demand special things," she said, and hurried off in the direction of the dining room. Paddington spent the rest of the day being rushed from one part of the house to another as preparations were made for his party. Mrs. Brown was busy tidying up. Mrs. Bird was busy in the kitchen. Jonathan and Judy were busy with the decorations. Everyone had a job except Paddington. "I thought it was supposed to be my birthday," he grumbled as he was sent into the drawing room for the 5th time after upsetting a box of marbles all over the kitchen floor. "So it is, dear," said Mrs. Brown, "but your time comes later." She was beginning really to regret telling him that bears had 2 birthdays every year, for already he was worrying about when the next one was due. "Now, you just watch out for the postman," she said, lifting him up onto the windowsill. But Paddington didn't seem very keen on this. "Or else," she said, "practice doing some of your magic tricks, ready for this evening." Among Paddington's many presents was a magic set from Mr. and Mrs. Brown. It was a very expensive one from Barkridge's. It had a special magic table, a large mystery box that made things disappear if you followed the instructions properly, a magic wand, and several packs of cards. Paddington emptied them all over the floor and settled down in the middle to read the book of instructions. He sat there for a long time, studying the pictures and diagrams and reading everything twice to make sure. Every now and then, he absent-mindedly dipped a paw into his marmalade jar, and then, remembering that it was his birthday and there was a big tea to come, he reached up and stood the jar on the magic table before returning to his studies. The first chapter was called spells. It showed how to wave the magic wand and the correct way to say abracadabra. Paddington stood up clutching the book in one hand and waved the wand several times through the air. He also tried saying abracadabra. He looked around. Nothing seemed to have changed, and he was about to try again when his eyes nearly popped out of his head. The jar of marmalade he'd placed on the magic table only a few minutes before had disappeared. He searched hurriedly through the book. There was nothing about making marmalade disappear. Worse still, there was nothing about making it come back again, either. Paddington decided it must be a very powerful spell to make a whole jar vanish into thin air. He was about to rush outside and tell the others when he thought better of it. It might be a good trick to do in the evening, especially if he could persuade Mrs. Bird to give him another jar. He went out into the kitchen and waved his wand a few times in Mrs. Bird's direction, just to make sure. "I'll give you abracadabra," said Mrs. Bird, pushing him out again, "and be careful with that stick, you'll have someone's eye out." Paddington returned to the drawing room and tried saying his spell backwards. Nothing happened, so he started reading the next chapter of the instruction book, which was called The Mystery of the Disappearing Egg. "I shouldn't have thought you needed any book to tell you that," said Mrs. Bird at lunchtime, as Paddington told them all about it. "The way you gobble your food is nobody's business." "Well," said Mr. Brown, "so long as you don't try sawing anyone in half this evening, I don't mind." "I was only joking," he said hurriedly, as Paddington turned an inquiring gaze on him. Nevertheless, as soon as lunch was over, Mr. Brown hurried into the garden and locked up all his tools. With Paddington, there was no sense in taking chances. As it happened, he has no cause to worry, for Paddington had far too many things on his mind, what with one thing and another. The whole family was there for tea, as well as Mr. Gruber. Several other people came along too, including the Browns' next-door neighbor, Mr. Curry. He was a most unwelcome visitor. "Just because there's a free meal," said Mrs. Bird. "I think it's disgusting, taking the crumbs off a young bear's plate like that. He's not even been invited." "He'll have to be quick to get any crumbs off Paddington's plate," said Mr. Brown. "All the same, it is a bit much after all the things he's said in the past, and not even bothering to wish Paddington many happy returns." Mr. Curry had a reputation in the neighborhood for meanness and for poking his nose into other people's business. He was very bad-tempered and was always complaining about the least little thing that met with his disapproval. In the past, that had often included Paddington, which was why the Browns had not invited him to the party. But even Mr. Curry had no cause to complain about the tea. From the huge birthday cake down to the last marmalade sandwich, everyone agreed that it was the best meal they had ever had. Paddington himself was so full he had great difficulty in mustering enough breath to blow out the candle, but at last he managed it without singeing his whiskers, and everyone, including Mr. Curry, applauded and wished him a happy birthday. And here's Paddington blowing out the candle on his cake. "And now," said Mr. Brown when the noise had died down, "if you'll all move your seats back, I think Paddington has a surprise for us." While everyone was busy moving their seats to one side of the room, Paddington disappeared into the drawing room and returned carrying his conjuring outfit. There was a short delay while he erected his magic table and adjusted the mystery box, but soon all was ready. The lights were turned off except for a standard lamp, and Paddington waved his wand for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, consulting his instruction book, "my next trick is impossible." "But you haven't done one yet," grumbled Mr. Curry. Ignoring the remark, Paddington turned over the page. "For this trick," he said, "I shall require an egg." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Bird as she hurried out to the kitchen. "I know something dreadful is going to happen." Paddington placed the egg in the center of his magic table and covered it with a handkerchief. He muttered abracadabra several times and then hit the handkerchief with his wand. Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other with great dismay. They were both thinking of their carpet. "Hey, presto!" said Paddington, and pulled the handkerchief away. To everyone's surprise, the egg had completely disappeared. "Of course," said Mr. Curry knowledgeably above all the applause. "It's all done by sleight of paw. But very good, though, for a bear, very good indeed. Now make it come back again." Feeling very pleased with himself, Paddington took his bow and then felt in the secret compartment behind the table. To his surprise, he found something much larger than an egg. In fact, it was the jar of marmalade. It was the one that had disappeared that very morning. He displayed it in his paw. The applause for this trick was even louder. "Excellent," said Mr. Curry, slapping his knee. "Making people think he was going to find an egg, and it was a jar of marmalade all the time. Very good indeed." Paddington turned over the page. "And now," he announced, flushed with success, "the disappearing trick." He took a bowl of Mrs. Brown's best flowers and placed them on the dining table alongside his mystery box. He wasn't very happy about this trick, as he hadn't had time yet to practice it, and he wasn't at all sure how the mystery box worked, or even where you put the flowers to make them disappear. He opened the door in the back of the box and then poked his head round the side. "I shan't be a minute," he said, and then disappeared from view again. The audience sat in silence. "Rather a slow trick, this one," said Mr. Curry after a while. "I hope he's all right," said Mrs. Brown. "He seems very quiet." "Well, he can't have gone far," said Mr. Curry. "Let's try knocking." He got up, knocked loudly on the box, and then put his ear to it. "I can hear someone calling," he said. "It sounds like Paddington. I'll try again." He shook the box, and there was an answering thump from inside. "I think he shut himself in," said Mr. Gruber. He too knocked on the box and called out, "Are you all right, Mr. Brown?" "No," said a small and muffled voice. "It's all dark, and I can't read my instruction book." "Quite a good trick," said Mr. Curry, some while later, after they had pried open Paddington's mystery box with a penknife. He helped himself to some biscuits. "The disappearing bear. Very unusual, but I still don't see what the flowers were for." Paddington looked at him suspiciously, but Mr. Curry was far too busy with the biscuits. "For my next trick," said Paddington, "I would like a watch." "Are you sure?" said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Wouldn't anything else do?" Paddington consulted his instruction book. "It says a watch," he said firmly. Mr. Brown hurriedly pulled his sleeve down over his left wrist. Unfortunately, Mr. Curry, who was in an unusually good mood after his free tea, stood up and offered his. Paddington took it gratefully into his box and placed it on the table. "This is a jolly good trick," he said, reaching down into his box and pulling out a small hammer. He covered the watch with a handkerchief and then hit it several times. Mr. Curry's expression froze. "I hope you know what you're doing, young bear," he said. Paddington looked rather worried. Having turned the page, he'd just read the ominous words, "It is necessary to have a second watch for this trick." Gingerly, he lifted up a corner of the handkerchief. Several cogs and some pieces of glass rolled across the table. Mr. Curry let out a roar of wrath. "I think I forgot to say abracadabra," faltered Paddington. "Abracadabra!" shouted Mr. Curry, beside himself with rage. "Abracadabra!" He held up the remains of his watch. 20 years I've had this watch, and now look at it. This will cost someone a pretty penny." Mr. Gruber took out an eyeglass and examined the watch carefully. "Nonsense," he said, coming to Paddington's rescue. "It's one you bought from me from next to nothing 6 months ago. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, telling lies in front of a young bear." "Rubbish!" spluttered Mr. Curry. He sat down heavily on Paddington's chair. "Rubbish! I'll give you—" His voice trailed away, and a peculiar expression came over his face. "I'm sitting on something," he said. "Something wet and sticky." "Oh, dear," said Paddington. "I expect it's my disappearing egg. It must have reappeared." Mr. Curry grew purple in the face. "I've never been so insulted in all my life," he said. "Never!" He turned at the door and waved an accusing finger at the company. "It's the last time I shall ever come to one of your birthday parties." "Henry," said Mrs. Brown, as the door closed behind Mr. Curry, "you really oughtn't to laugh." Mr. Brown tried to keep a straight face. "It's no good," he said, bursting out. "I can't help it." "Did you see his face when all the cogs rolled out?" said Mr. Gruber, his face wet with tears. "All the same," said Mr. Brown when the laughter had died down, "I think perhaps you ought to try something a little less dangerous next time, Paddington." "How about that card trick you were telling me about, Mr. Brown?" asked Mr. Gruber. "The one where you tear up a card and make it come out of someone's ear." "Yes, that sounds like quite a nice one," said Mrs. Brown. "Let's see that." "You wouldn't like another disappearing trick?" said Paddington hopefully. "Quite sure, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "Well," said Paddington, rummaging in his box, "it's not very easy doing card tricks when you've only got paws, but I don't mind trying." He offered a pack of cards to Mr. Gruber, who solemnly took one from the middle and then memorized it before replacing it. Paddington waved his wand over the pack several times and then withdrew a card. He held up the 7 of spades. "Was this it?" he said to Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber polished his glasses and stared. "You know," he said, "I do believe it was." "I bet all the cards are the same," whispered Mr. Brown to his wife. "Shh," said Mrs. Brown. "I thought he did it very well." "This is the difficult bit," said Paddington, tearing it up. "I'm not very sure about this part." He put the pieces under his handkerchief and tapped them several times with the wand. "Oh," said Mr. Gruber, rubbing the side of his head, "I felt something go pop in my ear just then, something cold and hard." He felt in his ear. "Why, I do believe—" He held up a shining object to the audience. "It's a pound! My birthday present for young Mr. Brown. Now, I wonder how it got in there." "Oh," said Paddington as he proudly examined it. "I didn't expect that. Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber." "Well," said Mr. Gruber, "it's only a small present, I'm afraid, Mr. Brown, but I've enjoyed the little chats we've had in the mornings. I look forward to them very much, and—" he cleared his throat and looked around. "I'm sure we all hope you have many more birthdays." When the chorus of agreement had died down, Mr. Brown rose and looked at the clock. "And now," he said, "it's long past all our bedtimes, most of all yours, Paddington, so I suggest we all do a disappearing trick now." "I wish," said Paddington, as he stood at the door waving everyone good night, "I wish my Aunt Lucy could see me now. She'd feel very pleased." "You'll have to write and tell her all about it, Paddington," said Mrs. Brown as she took his paw. "But in the morning," she added hastily. "You've got clean sheets, remember?" "Yes," said Paddington, "in the morning. I expect if I did it now I'd get ink on the sheets or something. Things are always happening to me." "You know, Henry," said Mrs. Brown as they watched Paddington go up the stairs to bed, looking rather sticky and more than a little sleepy, "it's nice having a bear about the house." And here is a little tent that Paddington Bear built in his room to take a nap in. So that is a disappearing trick. The chapter tomorrow will be A Picnic on the River, and I will also read Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. If you have any questions or suggestions for books you would like me to read, leave them in the comments below or send me a message, and I will try and find those books for you. But I hope you've enjoyed these stories. I certainly enjoy reading them every day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Bye!